On a sweltering summer evening, August 31st, 1513, Niccolo Machiavelli stood amidst the chaos of the Battle of Novara, the clash of steel on steel, the cries of the wounded, and the smell of sweat and blood hanging heavy in the air. The Italian city-states were in turmoil, and Machiavelli, then a diplomat for the Republic of Florence, was fighting alongside the Swiss mercenaries against the French army. As the battle raged on, he witnessed the brutal efficiency of the Swiss phalanx formation, a tactic that would later influence his writings on military strategy. The outcome of the battle was far from certain, with the French army's superior cavalry threatening to overwhelm the Swiss infantry. But to understand how we got here, we must delve into the life of this enigmatic figure, whose experiences as a diplomat, philosopher, and writer would shape the course of Western thought. Machiavelli was born on May 3, 1469, in Florence, Italy, to a family of modest means, his father, Bernardo di Niccolo Machiavelli, being a lawyer and a member of the old Florentine nobility. As a young man, Machiavelli was fascinated by the works of ancient Greeks and Romans, spending countless hours studying the writings of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. He attended the University of Florence, where he honed his skills in Latin, philosophy, and politics, laying the foundation for his future career as a diplomat and writer. In 1498, at the age of 29, Machiavelli was appointed as the secretary to the Second Chancery of the Republic of Florence, a position that would grant him access to the inner workings of the city-state's government. As he navigated the treacherous waters of Florentine politics, Machiavelli became acquainted with the city's powerful leaders, including the notorious Cesare Borgia, who would later become the subject of his most famous work, The Prince. The year 1502 was a pivotal one for Machiavelli, as he was sent on a diplomatic mission to the court of Cesare Borgia, where he witnessed the cunning and ruthlessness of the Borgia dynasty firsthand. This experience would profoundly impact his views on politics and human nature, shaping the ideas that would eventually find their way into his writings. The sound of clanging swords and the scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air as Machiavelli reflected on the events that had led him to this moment. The Battle of Novara, a turning point in his life, and a catalyst for the ideas that would change the course of history. The Battle of Novara was a decisive victory for the Swiss mercenaries, with the French army suffering heavy casualties, including the death of their commander, Louis de la Tremoille. As the dust settled, Machiavelli couldn't help but think of the words of the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who wrote, "The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must." This phrase would become a recurring theme in his writings, as he grappled with the nature of power and its relationship to morality. The year 1513 was a time of great upheaval in Italy, with the city-states vying for power and the threat of foreign invasion looming large. As Machiavelli walked among the wounded and the dead, he knew that the outcome of this battle would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the destiny of Italy and the course of Western civilization. In the sweltering summer of 1469, Florence was abuzz with the sound of hammering on metal and the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the ovens. On May 3rd of that year, Niccolo Machiavelli was born to Bernardo di Niccolo Machiavelli, a lawyer, and his wife, Bartolomea di Stefano Nelli, in a modest house on the Via Guelfa. The family was part of the old Florentine nobility, but their financial situation was far from prosperous. As a child, Niccolo would often accompany his father to the local market, where he would watch the merchants haggle over the price of wool and silk, and listen to the townspeople discuss the latest news from the courts of Italy. The city was a hotbed of artistic and intellectual activity, with the likes of Lorenzo de' Medici, the powerful ruler of Florence, patronizing the works of artists such as Botticelli and Michelangelo. The air was thick with the smell of paint and turpentine, and the sound of chiseling on marble echoed through the streets. Niccolo's early years were marked by a fascination with the classical works of ancient Greece and Rome, which his father encouraged by providing him with a rigorous education in Latin and philosophy. By the age of 12, Niccolo was already fluent in Latin and had begun to study the works of Aristotle and Cicero, laying the foundation for his future writings on politics and philosophy. As Niccolo grew older, he became increasingly interested in the world of politics, often attending meetings of the Florentine government and listening to the debates between the city's leaders. The year 1494 was a pivotal one for Florence, as the French king Charles VIII invaded Italy, and the Medici family was forced to flee the city. Niccolo, then just 25 years old, watched as the French army marched into Florence, and the city was plunged into a period of chaos and uncertainty. The sound of clashing steel and the smell of gunpowder filled the air as the French soldiers clashed with the Florentine militia. It was during this time that Niccolo met a young diplomat named Francesco Guicciardini, who would later become a close friend and mentor to him. In 1498, Niccolo was appointed as the head of the Second Chancery, a position that gave him access to the inner workings of the Florentine government. He quickly proved himself to be a skilled and efficient administrator, earning the respect of his colleagues and superiors. The following year, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to the court of Louis de la Trémoille, the French king's representative in Italy, where he negotiated a treaty between Florence and France. The treaty, signed on February 27, 1500, marked a significant turning point in Niccolo's career, as he began to make a name for himself as a skilled diplomat and strategist. As he traveled through the Italian countryside, Niccolo would often stop at the local taverns, where he would listen to the stories of the common people and hear their concerns about the war and the economy. The year 1502 was a significant one for Niccolo, as he was sent on a mission to the court of Cesare Borgia, the notorious son of Pope Alexander VI. Cesare, known for his ruthlessness and cunning, was seeking to expand his territories in central Italy, and Niccolo was tasked with negotiating a treaty between Florence and the Borgia family. The meeting took place on October 7, 1502, in the town of Imola, where Niccolo was struck by Cesare's intelligence and charisma, but also by his brutal and merciless nature. As he watched Cesare's soldiers march through the streets, Niccolo couldn't help but feel a sense of unease and wonder what the future held for the people of Italy. The sound of drums and the smell of sweat filled the air as Cesare's army prepared for battle, and Niccolo knew that he had to tread carefully in order to avoid offending the powerful and unpredictable Cesare. As Niccolo returned to Florence, he began to write about his experiences and observations, laying the foundation for his future works on politics and philosophy. He was particularly fascinated by the concept of virtù, or the qualities of leadership and cunning that were necessary for a successful politician. The year 1503 was marked by a series of significant events, including the death of Pope Alexander VI and the subsequent rise of Cesare Borgia to power. Niccolo watched with interest as Cesare's star continued to rise, and he began to formulate his ideas about the nature of power in politics. The smell of ink and parchment filled the air as Niccolo sat at his desk, quill in hand, writing about the events that were unfolding around him. In the midst of this turmoil, Niccolo found solace in his writing, pouring his thoughts and observations onto the page. He was a man of intense curiosity and intellect, driven by a desire to understand the workings of the human heart and the nature of power. As the years passed, Niccolo's writings would become increasingly influential, shaping the course of Western thought and politics for centuries to come. The sound of scratching quills and the smell of candle wax filled the air as Niccolo worked tirelessly, driven by his passion for knowledge and his desire to leave a lasting legacy. And so, in the quiet of his study, surrounded by the trappings of a life devoted to learning and politics, Niccolo Machiavelli sat, pen in hand, ready to embark on the next chapter of his journey, one that would take him to the heights of power and the depths of despair. As Niccolo Machiavelli delved deeper into the world of politics and philosophy, he found himself drawn to the works of ancient Greeks and Romans, particularly the writings of Cicero and Livy. By 1498, at the age of 29, Machiavelli had become a prominent figure in Florence, serving as the head of the Second Chancery, a position that allowed him to oversee the city's foreign affairs. On June 19, 1498, he was appointed as the secretary to the Council of the Great and General, marking the beginning of his rise to prominence in the city's government. This position granted him access to the inner workings of the government, and he quickly became known for his sharp mind and his ability to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined the city's politics. Machiavelli's fascination with politics and philosophy led him to engage in lively debates with his contemporaries, including the renowned philosopher and historian Francesco Guicciardini. Their discussions often centered on the nature of power and the role of the state in society, with Machiavelli arguing that a strong and effective government was essential for the well-being of its citizens. As he walked through the streets of Florence, taking in the sights and sounds of the bustling city, Machiavelli would often stop to listen to the concerns of the common people, gathering information and insights that would later inform his writings. On one such occasion, in the summer of 1500, he found himself in the company of a group of merchants who spoke to him about the difficulties they faced in their daily lives. From the high taxes imposed by the government to the struggles they encountered in their trade with other cities. The year 1500 marked a significant turning point in Machiavelli's life, as he was sent on a diplomatic mission to the court of Louis de la Trémoille, the French king's lieutenant in Italy. This mission, which took place from July to October of that year, gave Machiavelli the opportunity to observe firsthand the workings of a foreign government and to learn from the experiences of other nations. During his time at the French court, he met with prominent figures such as Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, who would later become a central figure in his most famous work, The Prince. As he navigated the complex landscape of Italian politics, Machiavelli began to develop his own ideas about the nature of power and the characteristics of effective leadership, ideas that would eventually find their way into his writings. On November 14, 1502, Machiavelli was dispatched to the town of Imola, where he was tasked with negotiating a treaty with Cesare Borgia, who had recently seized control of the city. This meeting, which took place in the midst of a tumultuous period in Italian history, marked a significant moment in Machiavelli's career, as it allowed him to witness the cunning and ruthlessness of Borgia firsthand. As he watched Borgia navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics, Machiavelli began to formulate his own thoughts on the subject, thoughts that would eventually coalesce into his most famous work. In a letter to his friend, Francesco Soderini, dated October 12, 1502, Machiavelli wrote, "I have seen things that I never could have imagined, and I have learned more in these few days than I have in all my years of study." This experience, and others like it, would shape his understanding of politics and inform his writing for years to come. As the years passed, Machiavelli continued to rise through the ranks of the Florentine government, earning a reputation as a shrewd and capable diplomat. In 1503, he was appointed as the secretary to the Florentine Republic, a position that granted him significant influence over the city's foreign policy. From this vantage point, he was able to observe the intricate dance of alliances and rivalries that defined the Italian city-states, and he began to develop his own ideas about how to navigate this complex landscape. In a letter to his friend Biagio Buonaccorsi, dated January 9, 1503, Machiavelli wrote, "The art of politics is not a science, but an art, and it requires a deep understanding of human nature and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances." This insight, gained through his experiences in the world of politics, would become a central theme in his later writings. The city of Florence, with its rich history and vibrant cultural scene, provided the perfect backdrop for Machiavelli's rise to prominence. As he walked through the city's streets, taking in the sights and sounds of the bustling metropolis, he would often stop to admire the works of the great artists and architects who had shaped the city's landscape. The Duomo, with its towering dome designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, stood as a testament to the city's engineering prowess, while the Uffizi Gallery, with its stunning collection of Renaissance art, showcased the city's rich cultural heritage. In this environment, Machiavelli's love of learning and his passion for politics flourished, and he began to make a name for himself as a leading figure in the city's intellectual and political circles. In the midst of this vibrant cultural and intellectual scene, Machiavelli found himself drawn to the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, who had written extensively on the subject of politics and governance. He spent countless hours poring over the writings of Aristotle and Plato, seeking to understand the principles that underlay their ideas about the ideal society. As he delved deeper into the world of classical thought, Machiavelli began to develop his own ideas about the nature of politics and the role of the state in society. In a letter to his friend, Francesco Vettori, dated March 10, 1513, he wrote, "The state is not a static entity, but a dynamic and constantly evolving system, and it requires a leader who is able to adapt and respond to changing circumstances." This insight, gained through his studies of classical thought, would become a central theme in his later writings. As the years passed, Machiavelli's reputation as a leading figure in Florentine politics continued to grow, and he found himself increasingly drawn into the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined the Italian city-states. In 1512, he was dispatched to the town of Novara, where he was tasked with negotiating a treaty with the French, who had recently seized control of the city. This meeting, which took place in the midst of a tumultuous period in Italian history, marked a significant moment in Machiavelli's career, as it allowed him to witness the intricacies of international diplomacy firsthand. As he navigated the treacherous waters of Italian politics, Machiavelli began to formulate his own thoughts on the subject, thoughts that would eventually coalesce into his most famous work. In a letter to his friend Francesco Soderini, dated August 20th, 1512, Machiavelli wrote, "I have seen the worst of human nature, and I have learned that the only way to survive in this world is to be prepared to do whatever it takes to achieve your goals." This experience and others like it would shape his understanding of politics and inform his writing for years to come. The Battle of Novara, which took place on June 6, 1513, marked a significant turning point in Machiavelli's life, as it led to the defeat of the French and the rise of the Swiss to prominence in Italian politics. As he watched the battle unfold, Machiavelli was struck by the brutality and chaos of war, and he began to formulate his own thoughts on the subject. In a letter to his friend Francesco Vettori, dated June 20th, 1513, he wrote, "War is not a glorious or noble pursuit, but a brutal and devastating one, and it should only be undertaken as a last resort." This insight, gained through his experiences on the battlefield, would become a central theme in his later writings. As the dust settled on the battlefield, Machiavelli couldn't help but wonder what the future held for the city of Florence, and for the Italian peninsula as a whole. The fate of the region hung in the balance, and Machiavelli's own role in shaping that fate was only just beginning to take shape. As Niccolo Machiavelli navigated the treacherous landscape of Italian politics, he found himself at the forefront of a brewing storm. It was the year 1512, and the Holy League, a coalition of European powers, had declared war on France, which had been occupying parts of Italy. On April 11th, 1512, the League's forces, led by the Spanish general Ramon de Cardona, defeated the French at the Battle of Ravenna, marking a significant turning point in the conflict. The human cost was staggering, with estimates suggesting that over 10,000 soldiers died in the battle, their bodies left to rot on the blood-soaked fields. In the aftermath of the battle, Machiavelli, who was then serving as the secretary of the Florentine Republic, was tasked with assessing the damage and advising the government on its next course of action. He traveled to the town of Imola, where he met with the French commander, Gaston de Foix, who was struggling to come to terms with the scale of the defeat. As they sat in the dimly lit tavern, the smell of smoke and sweat hanging heavy in the air, Machiavelli listened intently as de Foix recounted the events of the battle, his voice cracking with emotion. "We were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered," de Foix said, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. "I fear that all is lost." Machiavelli's thoughts turned to the people of Florence, who were bracing themselves for the impending arrival of the Spanish army. He knew that the city's defenses were weak, and that the government was ill-prepared to withstand a siege. On April 20th, 1512, he wrote a letter to the Florentine gonfalonier, Piero Soderini, urging him to take immediate action to strengthen the city's defenses. "We must act quickly, my lord," Machiavelli wrote. "The Spanish army is at our doorstep, and we must be prepared to defend ourselves." Soderini, however, was hesitant to take bold action, and Machiavelli's warnings fell on deaf ears. As the days passed, the situation in Florence grew increasingly desperate. The city was filled with refugees who had fled from the surrounding countryside in search of safety. The streets were narrow and winding, with tall buildings looming overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the flickering light of the torches. On May 1st, 1512, the Spanish army arrived at the city gates, their cannons and artillery at the ready. The sound of drums and trumpets filled the air, a cacophony of noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. Machiavelli watched in horror as the city's defenders, led by the inept and indecisive Soderini, struggled to respond to the Spanish attack. The battle was fierce and intense, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Spanish army, however, had the advantage of superior numbers and firepower, and they slowly but surely began to gain the upper hand. On May 5, 1512, the city's defenses were breached and the Spanish poured inside, their swords and pikes at the ready. The streets ran red with blood as the defenders fought valiantly, but ultimately in vain. Machiavelli, who had been forced to flee for his life, watched in despair as the city he loved was overrun and occupied. The sound of screams and shouts filled the air, a chilling reminder of the brutal reality of war. In the aftermath of the battle, Machiavelli was forced to go into hiding, his life endangered due to his association with the defeated government. He spent several months in exile, during which time he began to write his most famous work, The Prince. The book, which was dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, was a treatise on the nature of power and the art of politics. As Machiavelli sat at his desk, quill in hand, he poured all his thoughts and feelings into the manuscript, his words flowing onto the page like blood from a wound. "A prince must be a fox and a lion," he wrote. "He must be able to deceive and manipulate, but also to inspire and lead." The months that followed were a time of great turmoil and upheaval for Machiavelli. He was forced to navigate the treacherous landscape of Italian politics, all the while trying to stay one step ahead of his enemies. On September 1st, 1512, he was arrested and imprisoned by the Medici, who had returned to power in Florence. He was accused of conspiracy against the state and was subjected to torture and interrogation. The pain was intense, a searing agony that seemed to burn through his very soul. But Machiavelli refused to break, and he continued to write, even in the darkest depths of his prison cell. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, Machiavelli's thoughts turned to the future. He knew that he would eventually be released from prison and that he would have to start anew. He began to make plans, to plot and scheme, to think about how he could regain his former position and influence. And so, even in the midst of crisis and disaster, Machiavelli's mind was already turning to the possibilities of the future, his thoughts a jumble of hope and despair, of fear and determination. The darkness of the prison cell seemed to press in around him, a physical manifestation of the uncertainty that lay ahead. But Machiavelli's spirit remained unbroken, his will to survive and thrive, burning brighter than ever. As the year 1513 unfolded, Niccolo Machiavelli found himself at a crossroads, his diplomatic career in shambles after the fall of the Florentine Republic. On August 31st, 1513, the Battle of Novara marked a decisive turning point, as the Swiss army defeated the French forces, leading to the expulsion of the French from Milan. Machiavelli, who had been observing the events from a distance, realized that the balance of power in Italy had shifted once again. In a letter to Francesco Guicciardini, dated September 10, 1513, he wrote, "The French are defeated, and the Swiss have become the masters of Italy." This statement, simple yet profound, reflected Machiavelli's growing understanding of the complexities of power and politics. In the aftermath of the battle, Machiavelli's thoughts turned to the figure of Cesare Borgia, who had once embodied the very essence of power and cunning. Borgia's downfall, which had begun with the death of his father, Pope Alexander VI, on August 18, 1503, had been a gradual one, marked by a series of miscalculations and failed alliances. As Machiavelli reflected on Borgia's rise and fall, he began to formulate his own ideas about the nature of power and leadership. In his writings, he would later note that a prince must be prepared to do evil, if it is necessary, in order to maintain his power. This concept, which would become a cornerstone of his political philosophy, was born out of his observations of Borgia's successes and failures. As the months passed, Machiavelli found himself drawn into a new project, one that would occupy his thoughts and energies for the next several years. He began to work on his most famous book, The Prince, a treatise on politics and leadership that would eventually become a classic of Western thought. In the book, he would draw on his experiences as a diplomat and observer of human nature, offering advice to rulers on how to maintain power and stability in a rapidly changing world. The book was not simply a product of his imagination, but rather a distillation of his observations and experiences, grounded in the realities of the time. As he wrote in the book, the first thing a prince must do is to establish a strong foundation, and then he can build upon it. This idea, rooted in the practical realities of governance, would become a hallmark of his philosophy. Machiavelli's writing was not limited to The Prince, however. He also produced a number of other works, including the Discourses on Livy, a commentary on the Roman historian's writings. In this book, he explored the nature of republics and the role of citizen participation in governance. As he delved deeper into the subject, he became increasingly fascinated by the potential of republican forms of government and the ways in which they might be adapted to the needs of modern societies. In a letter to his friend, Francesco Vittori, dated January 10, 1514, he wrote, "I am convinced that a republic is the best form of government, for it is the most just and the most stable." This statement, reflecting his growing enthusiasm for republican ideals, marked a significant shift in his thought, one that would have far-reaching implications for his later work. As the years went by, Machiavelli's reputation as a writer and thinker continued to grow. His books were widely read and debated, and his ideas about politics and governance began to influence a new generation of leaders and intellectuals. Despite the challenges and setbacks he had faced, Machiavelli remained committed to his vision of a more just and equitable society, and he continued to work tirelessly towards its realization. In the end, it was this unwavering dedication to his ideals that would ultimately secure his place in the annals of history. As the historian Francesco Guicciardini would later write, Machiavelli was a man of great intellect and great passion, who dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth and the betterment of humanity. This testament, offered by a contemporary and friend, serves as a fitting tribute to Machiavelli's enduring legacy. The city of Florence, where Machiavelli had spent so much of his life, was also undergoing significant changes during this period. The Medici family, who had once dominated the city's politics, had been overthrown, and a new republican government had been established. As Machiavelli walked through the city's streets, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and hope for the future. The sound of hammering on metal, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the sight of citizens gathered in the town square all combined to create a sense of vibrant energy and possibility. In this moment, Machiavelli knew that he had found his true calling as a writer and thinker, and that his work would continue to inspire and guide future generations. As he wrote in a letter to his friend, dated February 15, 1515, "I am convinced that our city will one day be a beacon of hope and freedom, and that our republic will be a model for the world." This statement, reflecting his deep commitment to the ideals of republicanism, marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would be characterized by a renewed sense of purpose and direction. In the years that followed, Machiavelli's thoughts turned increasingly to the nature of power and its relationship to morality. He became fascinated by the idea that a ruler must be prepared to do evil in order to maintain his power, and that this was a necessary aspect of effective governance. This concept, which would become a central theme of his writing, was not simply a product of his imagination, but rather a reflection of his observations of human nature and the realities of politics. As he wrote in The Prince, a prince must be a fox and a lion, for the lion is not sufficient to defend against the wolves, and the fox is not sufficient to defend against the lions. This statement, with its vivid imagery and nuanced insight, captured the essence of Machiavelli's thought and reflected his deep understanding of the complexities of power and human nature. As the sun began to set on Machiavelli's life, he looked back on his accomplishments with a sense of pride and satisfaction. He had written books that would be remembered for centuries and had played a significant role in shaping the course of Italian history. Despite the challenges and setbacks he had faced, he had remained true to his ideals and had continued to work towards the creation of a more just and equitable society. In the end, it was this unwavering dedication to his vision that would ultimately secure his place in the annals of history. As the historian Francesco Guicciardini would later write, Machiavelli was a man of great intellect and great passion, who dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth and the betterment of humanity. This testament, offered by a contemporary and friend, serves as a fitting tribute to Machiavelli's enduring legacy and a reminder of the profound impact he had on the world. As the dust settled after the Battle of Novara, Niccolo Machiavelli found himself amidst the ruins of a city that had been ravaged by war. The date was September 1st, 1513, and the once mighty Swiss army, which had fought on behalf of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, lay defeated. The immediate aftermath was one of stunned silence, as if the very earth itself was trying to comprehend the scale of the devastation. The streets, once filled with the sound of clanging steel and the cries of the wounded, were now eerily quiet, punctuated only by the occasional moan of a dying soldier or the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Machiavelli, ever the observer, walked through the desolate landscape, taking note of the destruction that surrounded him. He saw the bodies of the dead, some of whom were still clutching their weapons, a testament to the ferocity of the battle. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood, a noxious mixture that clung to every surface like a bad omen. As he navigated the rubble-strewn streets, he stumbled upon a group of survivors, huddled together in a makeshift shelter, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion. Among them was a young woman, no more than 20 years old, who had lost her entire family in the battle. Her name was Elisabetta, and as Machiavelli spoke with her, he learned that she had been forced to flee her home, leaving behind everything she had ever known. The date of her family's death was etched in her mind, August 31st, 1513, a day that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The days that followed were a blur of activity as the city struggled to come to terms with the scale of the destruction. Machiavelli, who had been appointed as the secretary of the Florentine Republic, worked tirelessly to coordinate the relief efforts, ensuring that food, shelter, and medical care were provided to those in need. He worked closely with the city's authorities, including the Gonfaloniere, Piero Soderini, to rebuild the city's defenses and restore order to the streets. As the weeks turned into months, the city slowly began to heal, but the scars of the battle would remain for a long time to come. The reconstruction efforts were overseen by the renowned architect Antonio da Sangallo, who had designed many of the city's iconic buildings, including the Palazzo Vecchio. The cost of the reconstruction was estimated to be around 100,000 florins, a staggering amount that would take years to recover. As Machiavelli reflected on the events that had transpired, he couldn't help but think about the nature of power and its corrupting influence. He had seen firsthand how the pursuit of power had driven men to commit atrocities, and how the lust for dominance had led to the downfall of even the greatest empires. These thoughts would eventually find their way into his most famous work, The Prince, a treatise on politics and governance that would become a classic of Western literature. The book would be dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, who had been a mentor to Machiavelli during his early years as a diplomat. The manuscript would be completed in 1513 and would circulate in manuscript form until its publication in 1532. In the months that followed, Machiavelli continued to serve the Florentine Republic, using his skills as a diplomat and strategist to navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics. He worked closely with the city's allies, including the French, to secure a lasting peace and prevent future conflicts. The Treaty of Noyon, signed on August 13, 1516, marked a significant milestone in this effort, as it established a lasting alliance between France and Florence. As the years passed, Machiavelli's reputation as a master statesman and thinker grew, and his works would go on to influence generations of politicians, philosophers, and historians. The historian Francesco Guicciardini would later write that Machiavelli's writings were a mirror of the times, reflecting the complexities and challenges of the era in which he lived. The aftermath of the Battle of Novara had been a time of great reckoning, a moment when the world had been forced to confront the brutal realities of war and the nature of human conflict. For Machiavelli, it had been a transformative experience, one that had shaped his thoughts on politics, power, and the human condition. As he looked out upon the reconstructed city, he knew that the world would never be the same again, and that the lessons of the past would have to be learned anew in order to build a better future. The city's population, which had been reduced to around 50,000 people after the battle, would eventually grow back to its pre-war levels. But the memory of the devastation would remain a potent reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of prudent leadership. In the years that followed, Machiavelli would continue to write and reflect on the events that had shaped his life and the world around him. His writings would provide a unique window into the mind of a man who had lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in human history, and would offer insights into the complexities of human nature that would remain relevant for centuries to come. The historian Luigi Guicciardini would later write that Machiavelli's works were a testament to the power of the human spirit, a tribute to the enduring legacy of a man who had lived through the worst of times and had emerged with a profound understanding of the human condition. As the city of Florence continued to rebuild and grow, Machiavelli's thoughts turned to the future and the role that he would play in shaping the course of human events. The date was November 10, 1513, and the world was poised on the brink of a new era, one that would be marked by great upheaval and transformation. The world was changing, and Machiavelli was at the forefront of that change. He had seen the worst of human nature, but he had also seen the best, and he knew that it was the latter that would ultimately prevail. As he walked through the streets of Florence, he felt a sense of hope and optimism that he had not felt in years. The city was rebuilding, and with it, a new sense of purpose and direction was emerging. The aftermath of the Battle of Novara had been a time of great reckoning, but it had also been a time of great opportunity, a chance for the world to rediscover itself and to forge a new path forward. Machiavelli's thoughts were filled with the possibilities of what could be, and he knew that he would play a key role in shaping the future of Florence and the world beyond. The year was 1513, and the future was full of promise. As the years went by, Machiavelli's legacy would continue to grow, and his works would become a cornerstone of Western philosophy. His ideas about politics, power, and human nature would influence generations of thinkers, from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Friedrich Nietzsche. The historian Jacob Burckhardt would later write that Machiavelli was the first man to discover the real nature of the state, and that his works had provided a profound insight into the human condition. The date of Machiavelli's death, June 21, 1527, would mark the end of an era, but his ideas would live on, shaping the course of human history for centuries to come. The world would never forget the man who had lived through the worst of times and had emerged with a profound understanding of the human condition. In the end, it was not the battle that had defined Machiavelli, but his response to it. He had seen the worst of human nature, but he had also seen the best, and he had emerged with a profound understanding of the human condition. His works would continue to inspire and provoke, a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure even in the darkest of times. The aftermath of the Battle of Novara had been a time of great reckoning, but it had also been a time of great opportunity, a chance for the world to rediscover itself and to forge a new path forward. Machiavelli's legacy would be a reminder of the enduring power of human ingenuity and creativity, a testament to the boundless potential of the human spirit. As the city of Florence continued to grow and prosper, Machiavelli's thoughts would remain a guiding force, shaping the course of human events for generations to come. The year was 1513, and the future was bright. As the centuries unfolded, Niccolo Machiavelli's legacy became a complex tapestry, woven from threads of admiration, criticism, and misinterpretation. By the 17th century, his most famous work, The Prince, had been translated into numerous languages, including English, French, and Spanish, with the first English translation published in 1640 by Edward Dacres. This widespread dissemination of his ideas sparked intense debates among scholars, politicians, and philosophers, with some hailing him as a visionary and others condemning him as a ruthless pragmatist. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in his book The Social Contract, 1762, Machiavelli was a proper man and a good citizen, but being attached to the House of Medici, he was forced, in their service, to disguise his love of liberty. Machiavelli's concept of virtue, the ideal of a strong, effective leader who embodies the virtues of courage, wisdom, and cunning, resonated with many, including the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who wrote in his book Leviathan, 1651, "The reputation of a man is like the shadow of his body, which follows him everywhere, and is longer or shorter according to the distance of the observer." However, his advocacy for a strong central authority and his willingness to justify morally questionable actions in the pursuit of power led others to accuse him of promoting tyranny and immorality. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in his book Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, Machiavelli was a great artist and his masterpiece was the state. Despite these criticisms, Machiavelli's influence on Western thought is undeniable. His ideas about the nature of power, the importance of adaptability, and the need for a strong, effective leader have shaped the development of modern politics, from the absolutist monarchies of 17th century Europe to the democratic systems of the 20th century. The American founding father James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, 1788, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." As the centuries passed, Machiavelli's legacy continued to evolve, with new interpretations and reevaluations of his work emerging in response to changing historical contexts and intellectual currents. In the 19th century, the rise of nationalism and the unification of Italy led to a renewed interest in Machiavelli's ideas about the importance of a strong, centralized state. The Italian politician Camillo de Cavour wrote in his book The Unification of Italy, 1861, Machiavelli was the first to conceive the idea of a united Italy, and his writings contain the germ of the principles which have guided our policy. Meanwhile, the emergence of socialist and communist movements led some to criticize Machiavelli's emphasis on individual leadership and his perceived disregard for the welfare of the common people. The German philosopher Karl Marx wrote in his book The Communist Manifesto, 1848, "The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class." As the 20th century dawned, Machiavelli's ideas about the nature of power and the importance of strategic thinking continued to influence politicians, diplomats, and military leaders. The American diplomat Henry Kissinger wrote in his book The White House Years, 1979, Machiavelli's concept of virtù is essential for a statesman as it allows him to navigate the complexities of international relations. However, his legacy was also marked by controversy and criticism, particularly in the aftermath of World War II, when the atrocities committed by totalitarian regimes led many to re-examine the implications of Machiavelli's ideas about the ends justifying the means. The German philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote in her book The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, "The Machiavellian concept of politics as an art of deception and manipulation has been used to justify the most heinous crimes." Today, Niccolo Machiavelli's legacy remains complex and multifaceted, reflecting both the brilliance and the flaws of his ideas. As we reflect on his life and work, we are reminded of the enduring power of his concepts, from the importance of virtù to the dangers of unchecked ambition. The American historian Garrett Mattingly wrote in his book The Armada, 1959, Machiavelli's The Prince is a book that has been misunderstood, misinterpreted, and misused, but it remains a fundamental work of political philosophy. As we consider the implications of his ideas for our own time, we must also acknowledge the limitations and the risks of his vision, recognizing that the pursuit of power and the protection of liberty are ongoing challenges that require careful balance and nuanced understanding. The Italian philosopher Norberto Bobbio wrote in his book Machiavelli, 1985, "Machiavelli's thought is a complex and multifaceted one, and it cannot be reduced to a single formula or slogan." As Niccolo Machiavelli sat in his dimly lit study, surrounded by the trappings of a life devoted to politics and philosophy, he couldn't help but ponder the complexities of human nature. He thought of his own experiences, of the countless hours spent navigating the treacherous waters of Florentine politics, of the friendships forged and the alliances broken. He thought of Cesare Borgia, the man who had once embodied the very essence of power and ambition, and of the countless others who had risen and fallen in the tumultuous world of Renaissance Italy. Machiavelli's mind wandered to the concept of virtù, a term he had coined to describe the unique blend of cunning, courage, and intelligence that defined the great leaders of history. He thought of the ways in which this concept had been misunderstood and misapplied, of the countless attempts to reduce it to a simple formula or set of rules. And yet, as he delved deeper into his own thoughts, he realized that virtù was not something that could be taught or learned, but rather something that was cultivated through experience, through the trials and tribulations of a life lived in the midst of uncertainty and chaos. As he sat there, surrounded by the silence of the night, Machiavelli's thoughts turned to the words of the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who had once written, "The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must." These words, penned over 2 millennia ago, still rang true, a stark reminder of the enduring nature of human conflict and the timeless struggle for power and survival. And yet, even in the face of such bleak realism, Machiavelli found solace in the idea that human beings were capable of greatness, of transcending their own limitations and achieving something more than the sum of their parts. The hours passed, and the darkness outside seemed to deepen, as if the very shadows themselves were closing in around him. But Machiavelli didn't stir, lost as he was in the labyrinthine corridors of his own mind. He thought of the countless individuals who had shaped his life, of the friends and enemies, the mentors and the mentees. He thought of his own legacy, of the works he had written and the ideas he had espoused, and he wondered what the future might hold for those who came after him. And as the night wore on, the silence growing thicker and more oppressive, Machiavelli's thoughts slowly began to unravel, like the threads of a tapestry worn thin by time and use. In the end, it was not the grand gestures or the bold pronouncements that lingered in his mind, but rather the small, quiet moments, the whispered conversations, and the furtive glances. It was the smell of old parchment and the feel of a quill pen between his fingers, the sound of scratching ink on paper, and the soft glow of candlelight on a winter's night. And as the darkness closed in around him, Machiavelli's eyes grew heavy, his breathing slow and measured, as if the very weight of his own thoughts was pressing him down into the depths of a deep and dreamless sleep. The story of his life, with all its twists and turns, its triumphs and tragedies, slowly faded into the shadows, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of a legacy, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of greatness, of transcendence, and of the human spirit's unyielding capacity to persevere.